just play a bit of from the No Separate Justice Vigil from last week, just letting people know, again, the corruption that's going on in our wonderful Just Us system. I mean, it really is a matter of people standing up, getting informed, getting engaged in their life. I mean, I know it's hard. They're working, sorry, just trying to find a particular video that I am trying to bring up. Okay. Yeah, this is from a monthly vigil that takes place at 150 Park Row, which is in Lower Manhattan. It's the Metropolitan Correctional Center. And the first Monday of every month.
Technique.
Okay, this is from Amnesty International, Justin Mazzola. I did play some of this last week, but I think it's really good and it's really important. So I'm going to play this part again.
You know, the process that we're seeing among specifically the war on terror, but to connect it to the domestic sphere as well, is you're seeing that the solitary confinement issues that Victor brought up is that you notice the Khalif Browder case is a domestic case. So we're seeing that the practices that are from the domestic sphere are being expanded. We want to kind of turn that on its head and, you know, kind of collapse it all together so that we can see more freedom. We're all here for that reason. Finally, we want to bring up kind of a larger legal context to this discussion and talk about how the legislators and government officials are responding to these issues on a larger scale. So we have Justin Mazzola of Amnesty International to talk about kind of some of the legal issues and the way that the government has created this war on terror, or how they're kind of legislating.
Hi everybody. As Salah mentioned, I had a couple of recent developments and legal developments that I wanted to share with you. More overview in terms of the global war on terror, but also domestically, and some recent developments with the Special Rapporteur on torture. In terms of the global war on terror, I'm not sure how many of you noticed, but last month, during the passage of the military budget, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, one piece of legislation that was passed was the McCain-Feinstein Amendment. And what this does, and it was approved by the U.S. Senate, it basically codifies the existing U.S. law prohibiting torture in the executive order signed by President Obama in 2009. So basically what it does prevent is the next president from basically rescinding that executive order and saying that enhanced interrogation techniques are now okay under what is our existing legislation. It would effectively prohibit the use of enhanced interrogation techniques that were used most notably by the CIA in post-9/11 interrogations. So methods such as waterboarding, forced nudity, forced sexual acts, placing hoods or sacks over a detainee's head, or using duct tape over the eyes, applying beatings, electric shocks, burns, or other forms of physical pain, use of military dogs, inducing hypothermia or heat injury, mock executions, and deprivation of necessary food, water, or medical care, which are already prohibited under the executive order by Obama in 2009, as well as the Army Field Manual, would now be explicitly banned from interrogation use. However, those are the only good parts. When it comes to the rest of what actually wasn't covered by the amendment, from a practical standpoint, the amendment does not address the controversial Appendix M of Section 2-22.3 of the Army Field Manual, which addresses the restricted interrogation technique of separation, much like what we talk about in terms of isolated confinement here in the United States with terrorism trials. The purpose of separation is to deny the detainee the opportunity to communicate with other detainees in order to keep them from learning counter-resistance techniques or gathering new information to support a cover story, and decreasing the detainee's resistance to interrogation. This separation technique, although not allowed under regular interrogation techniques, is allowed under special authorized circumstances. Worryingly, this type of interrogation is allowed on specific unlawful enemy combatants, who we all know is often what people are classified as when they're picked up by the government, and who are not covered by the Geneva Convention for treatment of prisoners of war. The appendix lists out careful oversight and procedures in order to use separation, and say that separation techniques must be conducted humanely and in accordance with U.S. law, the law of war, relevant international law, and relevant directives. However, reasons to use separation are broad and open to wide interpretation, citing reasons such as to help overcome resistance and gain actionable intelligence, to safeguard U.S. and coalition forces, and to protect U.S. interests, which can pretty much mean anything and everything possible under the sun for an excuse to use it. Additionally, though Appendix 9 states that the sensory deprivation is prohibited, if physical separation is not possible, goggles or blindfolds and earmuffs may be used to create a perception of separation. Lastly, the amendment also does not mention the long-held practice of the CIA or FBI of using torture by proxy, in which U.S. armed forces turn a prisoner over to forces knowing they will be tortured. From a accountability standpoint, there basically is none. While the amendment codifies the President's executive order, it does nothing for those who suffered from the torture committed in the War on Terror. Instead, the agents who committed the acts and the government officials who authorized those acts can revel in a de facto amnesty for their crimes, knowing that their actions will not be criminally investigated by the U.S. government. In commemoration with the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture on June 26th, Amnesty International, the ACLU, and Human Rights Watch sent a letter to Attorney General Lynch urging a full investigation of violations of federal criminal laws related to the CIA secret detention program, which came about through the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Report on Torture, which was released 6 months ago. As you all know, the Senate Torture Report, released 6 months ago, provides significant new information related to the commission of serious federal crimes, including torture, homicide, conspiracy, and sexual assault. Yet in litigation, the Justice Department has represented that no one at the agency has opened the report, let alone reviewed it for evidence of criminal wrongdoing and human rights violations. Amnesty International, together with tens of thousands of human rights supporters in the United States and around the world, is urging the Justice Department to instead commit immediately and publicly to reviewing the Senate report and opening criminal investigations where warranted. If you have time, go to the Amnesty International website and look for the issues under torture. You can then see some of the actions and campaigning that are going on in relation to this, including sending the Department of Justice pages from the release summary of the torture report around some of the criminal wrongdoing and urging them to open the investigation. Another update that I wanted to alert you to domestically, and I apologize, it's a little dated, was the work done in Chicago around coalition work with regards to the torture by the Chicago Police Department. In May of this year, the Chicago City Council, after numerous years of campaigning, finally passed an ordinance providing reparations to those who were tortured by the Chicago Police Department in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. During that time, more than 100 men and women of color were systematically tortured, which included electric shocks, mock executions, and physical beatings, leading some to falsely confess to crimes they did not commit. Though Commander John Burge served 4.5 years of a sentence for committing perjury during federal investigations of these crimes, neither he nor other CPD officers served any time for the actual acts of torture that they committed. The ordinance includes a formal apology from the city mayor, creates a fund of $5.5 million for financial compensation for the survivors, and includes, among other things, a first-of-its-kind counseling center for survivors of domestic torture in the south side of Chicago. This is the first time such a center has ever been set up in the United States. Any other torture centers that do exist really apply to asylum seekers and refugees who suffered of acts of torture and persecution in their home countries and were resettled and relocated here. For the first time, we actually have a center that will treat individuals for torture that was committed here in the United States itself. The reason why I wanted to highlight these issues, and there's one more update that I wanted to bring up as well, is not only make you aware of the developments, but to recognize the fact that A, the Torture Amendment has no effects for acts of torture committed in the United States itself, and despite a 20-year push for reparations for survivors of torture in Chicago, we still lack accountability for the acts committed in the United States. Specifically, we need Congress to pass the Law Enforcement Torture Prevention Act, as well as to ensure that accountability is across the board when it comes to whenever somebody in the United States, either here or abroad, commits the act of torture. One other update I did have that I didn't write down was that the Special Rapporteur on Torture has been petitioning the United States for a number of years now to gain access to facilities such as MCC. There have been some pause in their discussions with the State Department, and they've asked Amnesty International for a list of facilities that we think that they should be visiting, including MCC, including immigration detention centers across the United States, as well as the Bureau of Prison and the CMUs and ADMAX facilities across the U.S. as well. I'm not sure where that's going at this point, but at least some discussions are continuing, and hopefully within the next few weeks or months there actually will be some developments where the Special Rapporteur will be able to gain access to those facilities and inspect them themselves. So thanks so much.
Hi, this is Alan Taylor Shearer, and I'd like to welcome you to 1800 Online. Hi, this is Alan Taylor Shearer from 1800 Online. You're listening to Awake Radio. Hi, this is Alan Taylor Shearer, the presenter of The Endgame, brought to you each weekday.
Okay, our next guest is Matthew Ho. Sorry, let me just close that out. My computer is running just a tad slow. Okay. Matthew?
Yeah, hey Kat, how are you?
Hi, thanks for being back on.
Of course, of course.
I'm just going to read your bio again. It's the one from the Huffington Post.
Okay.
Matthew Ho.
That's probably pretty accurate.
Yeah. Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy and the former director of the Afghanistan Study Group, a network of foreign and public policy experts and professionals advocating for change in U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. A former state development official, Matthew resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan over U.S. strategic policy and goals in Afghanistan in September of 2009. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew served in Iraq, first in 2004-05 in Salah, Anbar Province, with a State Department reconstruction and governance team, and then in 2006-07 in Anbar Province as a Marine Corps Company commander. When not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 to 2008. Matthew's writings have appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Defense News, The Guardian, Huffington Post, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. The Council on Foreign Relations has cited Matthew's resignation letter from his post in Afghanistan as an essential document. In 2010, Matthew was named the Ridenhour Prize Recipient for truth-telling, and you're also a member of the Board of Directors for... and then the bio kind of stops there.
Oh, I guess it gets cut off, huh? That's okay. You spent...
For the Council for a Livable World.
Yeah, and a couple other... I do work with Veterans for Peace as well, and Expose Facts and some other organizations that are really great and worthwhile organizations full of people who've got a lot of experience and people who've seen our country make mistakes, both here at home and abroad, and who are working very hard to try and keep us from making many of the same mistakes again. But I apologize for having you read that whole big bio. I need to find something else to put online rather than that thing that goes on and on and on.
That's okay. I mean, you know, if it's true, then why not, you know? I mean, you know, you deserve it, unlike a lot of the people that have the control. I mean, you know, like if we were to read, for instance, an accurate bio of, say, you know, George W. Bush, what would that read like?
Well, you know, it all depends on who writes it, right? You know?
If we were, if the truth were, you know, yeah, I'm just going to mention, it was a few weeks ago, you know, George Bush received Father of the Year award here in New York, and I actually got into the event and videoed some of it and took some photographs, and you know, it's pretty amazing that somebody like him is seen as Father of the Year while he's pretty much killing fathers and children all around the globe.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, my alma mater, I went to Tufts University up in Massachusetts, and this year the commencement speaker was Madeleine Albright. And, you know, during the 1990s when she was Secretary of State and UN Ambassador, and she very famously said, when she was confronted with United Nations data on how many Iraqi children had died because of our sanctions on Iraq during the 1990s, when they couldn't get enough food, enough medicine, enough parts for their infrastructure, how many, you know, 500,000 had died. And Madeleine Albright said, I think those numbers were worth it. I think that was worth what we're trying to do. So you have someone who is okay with 500,000 children dying because of sanctions, who my university decides is the right person to address, you know, the graduating seniors to give an honorary degree to. Right. And you're absolutely right, Kat. Like, what are these people's actual real resumes? That's why I thought it was so wonderful when Medea Benjamin and Code Pink tried to make a citizen's arrest of Henry Kissinger a few months ago when he was testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I mean, Kissinger was a man who helped carry out policies, helped concoct and enact policies that led to the deaths of millions of people. Right. And yet he is lauded and respected as one of the most influential and what we would say, the grand old man of American foreign policy. But the reality was his decisions, you know, helped or created the conditions for millions to die. But we honor these people and forget about the atrocities that they've helped create, helped foment, or look the other way on.
Yeah, this is why I like to talk about, you know, what I like to call, you know, the real debt, which to me is, you know, people just being in it, like they're in an information deficiency, where people like a Madeleine Albright, a Condoleezza Rice, or a Henry Kissinger, George W. Bush getting Father of the Year award, the fact that these people gain the amount of momentum that they gain is because they keep the public in an information deficit. You know, they do everything in secrecy. And like, to me, that is the, I mean, you know, the real debt is that they are not the people that they try to, you know, portray themselves to be. You know, just like in the previous conversation with the last guest about Greece, Samir Dosani, I think I'm saying his name right, you know, talking about Greece and, you know, the creditors that actually just, they don't want Greece to be free of the debt. They actually want to put more debt on them.
Sure.
So, you know, it's just, you know, so there's nothing, you know, right. It's not Greek that's actually in debt for, you know, actually it's the, to me, I mean, the, you know, the mindset of the people that have the control. it's their overinflated image of themselves and the momentum that they have, that and the people that they're crushing. I don't know why they can't be held accountable and exposed as the financial bullies that they are.
I think a lot of it is many of these people, because of who they were and because of identity politics or tribalism, or George W. Bush or Madeleine Albright, if you're a Democrat, they come to represent an extension of your identity, an extension of who you are. You voted for this person, you support this person, they look like you, they're the same ethnicity as you, and so you give them not the benefit of the doubt, so much as you just are on their side, that this person represents you. So for millions of Americans, they would agree that George W. Bush should be Father of the Year. They see nothing wrong with what he's done, nothing wrong with the invasion of Iraq or the response to Katrina or the crashing of the global economy or what have you. Madeleine Albright, same thing too. She is seen as this visionary woman leader, a stalwart of the Democratic Party, one of the mastheads of the American foreign policy establishment. And so I think people look at her and they see themselves, or they attach their identity, or they feel like that she represents them. So that is why they don't take a critical view. That is why they don't pay attention to or acknowledge the mistakes or the crimes or the atrocities these people have committed. I mean, very, very much what I see with my university, having someone like Madeleine Albright. Well, that says to my university they're willing to, again, disregard all the things she's been involved with in terms of military campaigns overseas, sanction campaigns overseas that have grossly violated human rights, because by having her as a speaker, because she chose to speak at Tufts University, Tufts is now a part of the establishment. So that's another aspect of this too. They just don't see representation or identity, but they're yours. You're part of the system. You're part of the establishment. And so I think that's quite a bit as well. Why people choose not to acknowledge, the crimes, for lack of a better word. And in many cases, that's exactly what they are. That many prominent figures in our society, both Democrat and Republican, commit.
So I know you've been on before, and we've spoke about this before, but I like to kind of repeat things because it's really important to tell the listeners again, what you saw when you were in the military and why you resigned.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And again, and thank you for this opportunity, Kat. I do. It helps me talking about it. It's therapeutic.
Yeah,
for me,
absolutely.
So I appreciate it. But no, I served in the Marine Corps for 10 years. I also served with the State Department as an appointed foreign service officer, and I served with the Department of Defense as a Department of Defense civilian as well, a U.S. government civilian. 3 times overseas at war, twice in Iraq, once in Afghanistan. When I was in Iraq, I was on a State Department team that was responsible for doing reconstruction work and political governance work. So I was involved in the local and the provincial politics. The province is like a state, basically. And I was also involved in reconstruction work. So I was involved with the billions of dollars that were being spent in Iraq. I actually had millions of dollars in cash in my possession. I had, at one point, the most I ever had, 2 safes in my bedroom where I had a pistol and an AK-47. I had $26 million in cash. And we used that money to try and buy influence. We used it to try and win allegiance, win loyalty of the people. We build schools. We rebuild water treatment facilities or electrical facilities. We put air conditioners in mosques. we did what we can to try and buy the people's allegiance. And then when I went back to Iraq as a Marine officer in command of a company of Marines, I was involved more in the combat side of things, though certainly my first time I was in combat quite a lot as well. But, when I got to Afghanistan with the State Department in 2009, the same mistakes we had been making in Iraq were being repeated in Afghanistan, particularly this willingness to not acknowledge that people were fighting us because we were occupying them.
Right.
That we were committing we were doing more harm than good. That as bad as Saddam Hussein was in Iraq, our invasion destroyed any semblance of a functioning society. It allowed for corruption to just come in as a different entity in terms of expatriates from America and from Iran. It allowed for extremist religious groups, whether it be Sunni or Shia, so either Al-Qaeda or, say, the Badr Brigades or Muqtada al-Sadr's group, to take power and press their religious ideology on people. And it descended the country into an absolute hell of civil war. And I saw us repeating these same mistakes in Afghanistan, except in Afghanistan, what was occurring by 2009 was that there was a Democratic administration in power, and the Democrats under President Obama wanted to win Afghanistan. So as the Republicans had lost Iraq, the Democrats wanted to win in Afghanistan to prove that they were better, basically. And so we surged in Afghanistan, and about halfway through my year in Afghanistan, I said, I can't do this any longer. I'm not going to be party to us occupying a country, letting our young men and women die, be killed, be maimed, and kill others for something that's not making us safe and actually making us less safe, because it's just falling right in line with the mantra and the propaganda of the terrorist groups. Plus, too, we're in the middle of another nation's civil war. We're just trying to pick winners and losers, and there is no way that is going to work. There's just no historical evidence of that working, let alone what I had seen us go through in Iraq, plus my time as a professional military officer and studying everything. So in 2009, I resigned my post in Afghanistan, and for the last 5.5 years, almost 6 years now, I've been working to try and end the wars as possible. I've gone on a path of coming to better understand nonviolence and peace, better understand the inefficacy and really the hopelessness of war, and getting along this way, doing something I never envisioned myself doing, and as well is working with people like yourself and meeting people all around the country and all around the world who desire for a better way, who realize that what has been going on for centuries, and specifically for decades, has been warfare for the betterment of a few at the expense of the many.
Right. I just can't help but recognize the similarities again to the situation in Greece. Like the people that, I don't even know if they're even claiming to want to be helping Greece get out of the debt anymore, but they clearly are, don't want to help Greece get out of the debt and actually want to keep them in the debt. And
yes.
So it sounds like similar. What you're just talking about militarily is the opposite of what the military claims to be doing.
Yes, you're right, Kat. There's actually an element of pride to this. So a lot of people think this is all about money, and certainly the money is very important, not saying that, or about resources. And certainly in the Middle East, oil is very important. We've spent, according to Princeton University, we've spent between $8 and $9 trillion, trillion with a T, since Jimmy Carter was president, being the police force for the Persian Gulf. And look what's occurred. And now certainly we wouldn't have spent that money. Jimmy Carter and every president since would have considered the Persian Gulf a national security priority for the United States if there wasn't oil there. But there are a lot of other factors involved. Ideology, pride, the lust for power, that just as you're saying with Greece, people want to keep the Greeks down. They want to be creditors. They don't want the debtors to have a chance. They need to maintain the order that they have. They need to maintain the established hierarchy they have. They want to maintain the status quo. They're afraid of any upheaval, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the same type of mindset, the same mania for power, the same lust for whether it be military or political or economic dominance of someone else.
And so recently, or not that long ago, you were interviewed by Jesse Ventura.
Uh-huh.
And you guys were talking about, more troops going to, I think it was, I can't even keep up anymore. Was it Iran?
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? Going to Iraq.
I was going to say that. And, but it was, right, it was for, training, some sort of training purposes and not actually, actual warfare. And can you talk a little bit also about the United States funding ISIS, and then saying on the other side of their mouth that they're trying to, that ISIS is the terrorists, but the terrorists actually have a legitimate grievance.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing is ever as simple as people make it out to be. Nothing is ever as black and white. There's no, I don't believe in good versus evil. I believe there's good and then there's an absence of good. So what occurs with these training missions and what Jesse Ventura and I were talking about, as many people are aware, over the last year, the number of American forces in Iraq have steadily climbed to now near 4,000. We just announced we're sending some fighter planes there, some F-16s. And the logical conclusion, if you look at what the strategy is as the Iraqi army grows, which it's not doing, but as the plan is, the Iraqi army grows, we'll need to send more troops. So this idea that somehow there's going to be a limit on how many we send is just doesn't make sense based on the strategy that as the Iraqi army grows, so much our training presence must grow. And one of the things, just a quick aside on all this, in terms of the Iraqi army and the number that we've trained over the last year after the Iraqi army fell apart last year because they were so unbelievably corrupt and mismanaged and had no desire to fight, mainly, again, because the Iraqi army was just a corrupt money-making machine. Only about 7,000 Iraqi soldiers have been trained over the last year by the United States in this emergency effort that President Obama instituted last year. And you say, my God, 7,000, that's hardly any. And you realize the reason why, and the administration will never say this, but the reason why it's only 7,000 because there are not many Iraqis who want to fight for the United States, who want to be trained by Americans. It's just that simple. After all this decade plus of war, there's a very, very strong aversion to the United States of America in many parts of Iraq, and most of Iraq, with the exception of Kurdistan up north where the Kurds are, in Mosul or not Mosul, but Erbil and Sumania and other places. But, the Islamic State, Kat, I'm glad you brought this up about how so we invaded Iraq in 2003. There is no al-Qaeda presence in Iraq in 2003. That's quite clear. We invade, al-Qaeda uses that as a chance to recruit. And thousands of young men come from all over the Muslim world to fight the Americans in Iraq because this was what they saw. They saw it as an invasion. They saw this as their chance to defend their people, their faith, their lands against crusaders. And famously, George Bush used that term one time, which was, no accidental slip of the tongue, I don't think. So what occurs, though, is al-Qaeda eventually loses its position with the Sunnis in Iraq for a variety of reasons. So by 2009, 2010, they are very marginalized. They're very small. They've been discredited. They have very little support in Iraq at that point. And at that point, things start to flare up in Syria. And the Obama administration, because most of its foreign policy people come from the same lineage as the Republicans do, have this crazy attachment to Syria, and attachment to Bashar al-Assad, and attachment to the old way, the old Cold War order. And so they see this as a chance to get rid of Assad and score a point. Also, as well, too, I firmly believe that the United States have been left out of most of the Arab Spring. You saw us join the civil war in Libya to kill Gaddafi and then let it go into complete shambles. But for the most part, the United States client regimes, the dictators we were supporting all throughout the Middle East, were overthrown or attempted to be overthrown in the Arab Spring. So in Syria, I think the Obama administration saw an opportunity for the United States to do something. And what they decided to do was to turn what was starting a peaceful revolution against Assad and the regime in Syria into a violent one. And along with other groups, along with other sources, using the secret service agencies from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, from the Persian Gulf kingdoms like Qatar and UAE, started to finance and provide logistics to various groups in Syria to overthrow Assad. This included al-Qaeda in Iraq, who had moved across the border into Syria to take part in this lawlessness, to find a home there, to try and gen up support. And so in the thinking of our best and brightest in Washington, D.C., the idea was that we could somehow use al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had now changed names and called itself the Islamic State in Iraq, use what was called ISI, Islamic State in Iraq, to overthrow, along with these other groups, Assad and his regime. And of course, what we have now is that completely went out of control. We funded them, we provided intelligence to them, we sent weapons and ammunition and radios, and as most wars, as almost all wars, particularly these guerrilla insurgency civil wars, it spun completely out of control. It didn't work out the way that, quote unquote, our best and brightest in Washington, D.C. thought it would. And not only that, these people had this notion that somehow we could control al-Qaeda or we could control the Islamic State in Syria and then also control them in a different manner in Iraq, so that we could set them loose to bring down Assad in Syria while controlling them and make sure they didn't cause any problems in Iraq. And of course, that was never going to work. Anyone who knows anything about that region of the world knows that there really isn't much of a border, and that tribes and loyalties and ethnicities overlap across those borders. But, if the extent of your knowledge is that you worked on the Obama campaign, and that's why you have a position on the National Security Council, it probably does sound like it might work to you. And I don't mean to be snarky, but these are the types of decisions that allow for an organization like the Islamic State to grow, do well, gain in territory, gain in loyalty, answer the grievances of the local Sunni populations that are revolting against both the Syrian government and the Iraqi government, and to do so by being directly and indirectly funded by the United States through Turkey and Saudi Arabia and other nations. And so this really is what's occurring in Iraq and in Syria is just not a mess we created in 2003. It's a mess that we have continued and allowed to blow up because we thought we could control war, we thought we could control religion, we thought we could control ethnicities, we thought we knew better than the people who were actually there. And so now the most amazing thing, and I don't use amazing in a good manner, but in the sense that this is just colossal, is that the Islamic State now has a presence around the world. In Libya, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, and that something that was really nothing a few years ago, 5 years ago, has grown into this beast.
Isn't it amazing? Because even al-Qaeda got larger after
absolutely.
the U.S. started sending troops to take care of them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the greatest recruiting boon for Al Qaeda was not the 9/11 attacks. It was not the attacks on July 7th, 2005 in London. It was not the attack on the USS Cole or the our embassies in 1998 or whatever. It was the American invasion of Iraq. That gave them legitimacy. Everything they have been saying up to that point about how they were defending the faith of Islam against the West and against corrupt rulers in the Middle East and against Israel, and et cetera, was now all of a sudden put into motion. There was real evidence. There were a couple 100,000 Western troops in Iraq. And so if you were a young man who was upset by that, Al-Qaeda was a solution for you to go and fight against the invaders, against the crusaders, against those who were attacking your people, your faith, your lands. What's so interesting about this, Kat, is that this is the very same phenomenon that the United States used against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And what we've seen, that those networks that we helped create and finance in the 1980s to allow Arabs like Osama bin Laden to go to Pakistan and go to Afghanistan to help fight the Soviets were the same networks, the same conduits, the same resources that were used over the last decade to help young Arab men do exactly what their fathers and grandfathers did a couple of decades before and go and fight the outside invader in another Muslim country. So in the fact that now the Islamic State is in Afghanistan, which is the birthplace of this notion of this American notion of somehow being able to control the pent-up, angry, extreme Islamic jihadist forces that were erupting in 1978 and 79, it's amazing to me that the Islamic State is in Afghanistan now because the circle has really come full wheel.
And you're never going to hear on the mainstream, like they always talk about this country, and Obama's always saying how, oh yeah, we have to get ISIS, those terrorists, but they're never going to say like, yeah, we fund them, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, absolutely. You're never going to hear about the mistakes, the arrogance, the incompetence,
right,
the hubris, the greed that led up to all this.
Right. So they, again, like they just keep, this government just keeps perpetuating the debt,
Absolutely.
Every time you don't admit a mistake, every time you don't admit an oversight, I mean, whatever you want to call it. I mean, but of course, if they're doing it deliberately, they're not going to admit that.
Well, exactly. It's funny that they will at some point, and I'm thinking about, so most people think that the United States started funding the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And again, here's where we really formulated this idea that we're going to use holy Islamic war against our enemy, the Soviet Union. And the blowback on that has just been absolutely incredible, as we all know. But most people think that we started that after the Soviets invaded in December of 1979. But, according to both Bill Gates, who was, Secretary of Defense and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor in the 70s, the American government started funding the Afghan resistance months, 6-7 months before the Soviets invaded, to try and cause problems for the Soviets there, to try and overthrow the communist government on the border of Afghanistan, on the border of the Soviet Union, to cause issues for the Soviets, to make life hard for them, to try and put them into this great geopolitical military quandary that ultimately led to the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, being there for 8 or 9 years, killing over 1 million people, if not more, and precipitating this war that's still going on in Afghanistan, let alone the rise of Al-Qaeda, the rise of Islamic State, et cetera, et cetera. So they will sometimes, and the thing about it is Brzezinski and Gates are proud about this accomplishment. They feel like it was well done, like it really got one over on the Soviets, like it was a master stroke of covert operation, that these are the real spy masters in the the grand masters of the geopolitical chess scene, or whatever however they like to describe themselves. And the debt of this, Kat, is the millions, the tens of millions, actually probably hundreds of millions of lives that have been shattered because of it. You know, all the mothers who've lost sons in these wars, all the fathers and mothers who've lost children, the destruction of entire nations' souls, you know, just the retardation of any type of progress or dreaming or hope in these countries. And we see that in our own country. I mean, again, it came back to haunt us with the 9/11 attacks. And how we live now, where we're all spied upon. The U.S. government, you know, keeps tabs on all of us, collects all our data. You know, to the silly, to the fact we go to the airport, we have to take our shoes off continuously. Just those kinds of things, let alone, you know, the fact that how much more we spend on defense now. We spend, you know, 50 or 60% more just on the base defense budget, let alone the couple $1 trillion we've spent on the Iraq and the Afghan war, and what that could have been done, what that could have been used for in our country. You know, one of the numbers, I think the number that, according to Linda Bilmes at Harvard University, the number that just blows me away and blows other people away is that so far, just already, you know, the U.S. government, we, the people of the United States, have spent almost $300 billion on interest payments for the Iraq and Afghan wars. I mean, you think about that. Just on interest payments, we have spent $300 billion. I mean, what that could be used for. So this notion that somehow what we did was correct is just, you know, absolutely insane. And the debt that you speak of is, you know, is very real in terms of bodies and money, but also, too, very real in terms of our morality and our soul.
I wanted to just ask you, because I get these emails from Frontline, you know, PBS, and tonight, to me, this sounds like propaganda. Tell me what you think. It's called Frontline Escaping ISIS. You will never forget the women you meet tonight. Women like Ida, 21 years old, who says she was abducted by ISIS with her 2 young children and held in a home that ISIS had turned into a prison. An 18-year-old Amal, who was taken captive by an ISIS commander and his 6 bodyguards, and says she is still in pain from being raped repeatedly. I mean, I'm sure, you know, like, I don't doubt that the stories are true, but it's, again, like, I just feel like they want to emphasize this fact that ISIS is the bad guy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they are terrible. But the crimes that are being committed on the other side are just as terrible. You know, both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have been very thorough and very assertive in their condemnation of the Iraqi government and Shia militias and the atrocities they're committing against Sunnis. And this is why the Sunnis support the Islamic State. Look, the Sunni people in Iraq are not overwhelmingly in favor of these radical extremists running their lives. But it's a safer bet and a better bet for them than putting themselves under the thumb of the Iraqi government and the Shia militias, which they've lived through already. Everyone thinks that, not everyone, but the conventional wisdom is that the Islamic State all of a sudden just took over Mosul about a year ago, you know, last June 2014, and nothing had occurred before. You know, and this is the great fallacy in the way so many people speak about our wars. They talk about them in a solitary event. You always get referenced World War II as the good war, the great war, but it was World War II. It was an extension of the First World War. If you look at World War II as a solitary event, yes, sure, defeating Imperial Japan, stopping the concentration camps, yes, those are good things. But if you understand it in the entire context of the fallacy of war, going back to 1914 and the militarism, the nationalism that led to that, then you understand it in the utter horror that it actually was. And so in this way, too, yes, for Frontline to talk about the atrocities that the Islamic State is committing is all well and good, but certainly it is going to cause harm to people's understanding of the conflict if they don't understand that atrocities are being committed by all sides. And that is why all sides have fervent recruits. That is why all sides have the allegiance of their respective people, whether they be Sunni or Shia Arabs or Kurds or Alawites or whoever. And so it is. I get very concerned when organizations like Frontline tell such a one-sided story.
And they don't get to the
root. It doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah, they're not getting to the root. It's like they're, it's like they're just sort of skimming the surface, I feel, and not, like what actually causes ISIS.
Exactly. You know what? It's exploitation, really. I mean, you're exploiting these terrible stories, these horrible stories of suffering, without examining the causes of the suffering. Why are those people suffering? Why has this war been going on in Iraq?
And that ISIS is actually a victim.
Well, yeah. I mean, in the sense that, I wouldn't call them victims. They certainly have their free will, and they are just as culpable as the Shia militias or Assad's army or any of the other, the Kurdish factions, which certainly it's being documented now that the Kurds, the atrocities they're committing against Sunni civilians in the north. It doesn't end. And this is the spiral of violence. This is the cycle of violence that people talk about, how once it starts, it is impossible to end. You look at it over and over again. You look at it, what occurred in Rwanda. You look at what occurred in Bosnia, where people in the former Yugoslavia, where people who were neighbors, who grew up next to each other, who married each other's, whose children married each other, then turned and slaughtered one another based upon centuries-old differences in ethnicities and cultures. And, one of the things that's so amazing about, say, Rwanda is that, you look at what occurred there with the Hutu and the Tutsis, and there's actually really no difference at all. There's no ethnic or religious or racial difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis. It was this fabricated construct, really, most of it done by the Belgians when the Belgians colonized it, to try and tell who was rich and who was poor. So, basically the law when Belgium had the colony there was that if you had more than 10 cows, you were a Tutsi, and if you had less than 10 cows, you were a Hutu. That was basically it. And decades later, that allows people to machete each other to death. And you saw the same in Iraq and in Syria and in Libya. People who lived in harmony, and I saw this with my own eyes, people who lived next door to each other for decades, who lived in peace, again, whose children married one another, were within the span of weeks or months turned against each other, launched into this cycle of violence that is just continuing unabated, and that results in the Islamic State, that results in these Shia militias, that results in the Assad death squads. And it is. The victims are the people. And then, of course, there are those who, on all sides, who will capitalize on it, try and gain power, try and gain notoriety. The greed comes in. There are people who are making, who are doing very well off these wars. And they are groups like the Islamic State. They are groups like the Shia militia. And they are the American defense corporations, of course.
Why don't they suffer from any kind of moral injury? I guess you got to have morals to be injured.
I think that's exactly the answer, Kat. I don't know any other thing to say or any other. I don't know how else to respond to that, but how you precisely responded to it, which is simply that. Maybe they just don't have morals. Maybe there's an absence of morality. I said it earlier. One of the things I've come to understand about life and humans and divinity is that there is no evil, that there's only an absence of good. And maybe within these people, there is, because of fear, primarily because of fear, but also because of greed and other things, but primarily because of fear, they have lost the capacity or failed to see the morality, failed to see the harm they're doing. And it's most egregious, I think, in our country, the people who work on these issues, the defense corporations, the consultants, whoever, who are making a couple $100,000 a year, their fear is that they won't be able to buy a new BMW next year or send their children to private school. And so is that why they continue to go along with a policy that allows for the deaths of millions around the world? Is that why people who work for Boeing or Booz Allen or whoever, let alone those who are still in the intelligence services of the military, are able to justify to themselves going along with something that they internally know is wrong? I think, again, it comes to fear, not being able to live the lifestyle that they want, and so they justify it because their kids need to go to private school, their wife needs a new BMW, if just a couple more years and they can afford a second home, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So, you know, they have, you know, I mean, a lot more than they can actually ever use, while depriving, you know, people of just even their rightful crumbs.
Yes.
I wanted to...
well, not just the crumbs, depriving people of their lives. I mean...
Right, and their rights.
Yeah. Their rights, I mean, it is. It just comes back to basic human rights that we seem to continually violate around the world, with little ponderance, with little examination, with little investigation. I mean, Iran, of course, is in the news right now, and almost all media outlets will refer to the 1979 revolution in Iran that overthrew the Shah, and that, of course, the American hostages in the embassy for 440 days, and et cetera, you know. But very few will go farther back and explain that in 1953, the American government, because a democratically elected government in Iran wanted to nationalize the oil, they overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953 and installed the Shah of Iran.
Right.
Then created a police state that was horrible, absolutely terrible.
Well, done by the economic hitmen.
Yeah, exactly, right? You know, I mean, and so but that's something that we don't examine. We don't talk about. We don't talk about our own debt to these countries, what we really owe to them. You know, you'll find very little reference to the fact that 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago now, the United States staged the coup in Ukraine. Everyone talks about, the media is quick to talk about how Russia annexed Crimea, but very little is talked about how the United States basically staged a coup in Ukraine, and for the last decade and a half, even longer, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the end of the Cold War, has been pushing troops. I mean, we have troops stationed right on Russia's borders now, and this is a nation, Russia's a nation that lost 50, 60 million people in the world wars of the last century. Their fear is pretty well rooted of invasion. But that's very rarely referenced or understood. So this debt that we have, and I think that's just a wonderful term you use, Kat, as a nation, to other nations in the sense of either what we've done to them in terms of the coups, and William Bloom, of course, is the best person, BLUM, the best person to reference on, you know, but even too, just go to Wikipedia and Google American coups against other country, and the list is as long as your arm. You know, the debt we owe to other countries, but then also to what we're currently doing to scare other countries, to make people feel violated, to just really ratchet up the destruction of human rights, all while we proclaim that what we're doing is right and justified and that we're spreading democracy. And we certainly haven't. If anyone thinks Iraq or Afghanistan are democracies, they certainly don't understand what's occurred there. They are two of the most corrupt nations in the world, as listed by Transparency International, and they are also the least free countries in the world, as ranked by the Freedom House, which is not a liberal, bleeding heart organization by any chance. Dick Cheney was on the board of that organization, but they are not free. The only countries that are less free than Iraq or Afghanistan in terms of its political structure are countries like Saudi Arabia, who we give weapons to and munitions and provide fuel for their planes so that they can bomb and massacre civilians in Yemen. So really the debt we have to other nations is quite massive.
I call it mental climate shift. You know, like the temperature, you know, like using the global warming or something as an example. I mean, the shift of the mentality that, the powers that be have been able to take the public, a lot of the public, not everybody, but shift them over, so much, to actually believe. And I'm praying to God that this situation with Greece will snap a lot of people out of it. But I mean, right, like, because everything is so blatant. I mean, what's going on in Gaza, and now there's a famine in Yemen, right, and I mean, I used this example earlier in the first hour, in pertaining to Greece, how it's illegal to feed the homeless. It's like, I mean, things are just so blatantly ridiculous, and that's how sort of mentally shifted everything has gone. I mean, and it always brings me back to one of my favorite quotes by James Madison. I don't know if I ever shared it with you or not.
I don't know. I don't think so.
But I mean, I pretty much have it memorized because I've referred to it numerous times. He says, "I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedoms of the people by those in power by slow and gradual encroachments than by sudden and violent usurpations." So it's something like that. I mean, I almost have it right, but so it's right. It's the the slow and gradual shift and hurting that the powers that be have done to the people. And Greece is almost like this culmination that just is like exploding now. And, so for the other people who haven't quite gotten to that point as Greece has, so that's why they're like still maybe on the fence. But, again, hopefully what's going on in Greece, and I don't understand how what's going on in Gaza and all these wars that you're talking about, are I mean, things should just be clear. What's going on should be clear, and yet the powers that be have managed to convince a lot of people that what they're doing is good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's done for their benefit. It's done for their interests. That if you don't listen to us, these others, whether they be freeloaders, whether they be people of a different color, whether they be different ethnicities, whatever, are going to take what's yours. And I think that's the way the Greek crisis is being portrayed by much of the media in the United States, is that it was a system that people were freeloading on, a system that people were trying to get away with, getting something for nothing. And I understand there were issues in Greece regarding no one was paying their taxes. I mean, that's a big problem. But the thing about it, though, Kat, is exactly that. There's this us versus them mentality that is foisted upon most of the population by those who are by the elite, by those who are the establishment, by those who are, on Wall Street, in the powers of in the halls of Congress, at the big corporations. And they use that. They use that divisiveness. They use that us versus them to try and make sure that their power is solidified. I think the example, and what's happening in Greece, certainly it's happened all over the world in the last 10 years with the economic collapse the world endured. There are certainly millions of Americans who have not gotten their lives back together since the economic collapse of 2007, 2008. And then you wonder why no one gets punished, but then you see, Eric Holder, who was our Attorney General, the man who was responsible for going after these big banks that crashed the economy and ruined people's personal incomes and personal lives. He goes back to the same law firm he came from, and this is the big law firm, Covington and I'm forgetting now, Covington and whoever, but they're the ones who protect the banks. They're the ones who represent the banks. Now you got the Attorney General going right back to the law firm he was at that has been protecting and defending these banks all along. And so, if we actually think that any justice is going to come out of it, if the average American is going to see any justice for the economic crime that was done against him by the big banks, then, we're foolish, because our system is set up that those in power stay in power and help everyone else in power.
Well, that's why we can't go through the system to seek justice and recovery. We have to go and go around it or under it or overthrow it or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how do we do that? How do we make the world a better place? How do we organize and create a new construct for ourselves to govern ourselves in a manner that's consistent with how technology has emerged, how economics economics been used against the majority of the people. It's staggering. You look at our defense budget, $615 billion, and pretty much, and that's not a problem. That will pass. That will pass. I mean, they'll get their money, right? But if you look at what literally all the leading economists and development experts and the UN and other organizations say what is needed to end hunger in this world, it's $30 to $40 billion. But we would never be able to do that. We would never. Why can't our Congress come together and put together a package of $30 to $40 billion, 5% of our defense budget, to end world hunger? But because that's not what they want. They want division. They want strife. They want the romance of war, as well as also too the money that's involved in all that.
It's like war pornography. I mean, it
absolutely is. It absolutely is.
We only have like a few minutes left, and I wanted to, while you're still with us, encourage the listeners to please check out my YouTube channel, April and then Waters with 2 T's, and please even donate $1 if each viewer donated $1. There's a link on my YouTube channel that would be great. And I just also wanted to, because I mean it takes like a lot of support to bring, to uncover all of this, this stuff, because it's not easy to get the support or the funding. But this Friday, the 17th, it's a year that Eric Garner was strangled there on Staten Island, and the family. I just kind of wanted to, share this. They originally rejected a $5 million settlement, and then just recently accepted $5.9 million. But, of course they're getting money, but the officer is not being held accountable. And I just feel like it's just sort of like the microcosm of the macrocosm, like Eric Garner sort of represents like the microcosm, and Greece represents being, choked is the macrocosm, and the people doing the choking don't want to ease up their chokehold, and right, if they even happen to kill the person, they're never held accountable.
No, absolutely not. And they control all the money, so a $6 million settlement is not much for the city of New York. However, and it does, but really, I mean, what does $6 million do for the family of Eric Garner? It doesn't bring them back. I mean, it doesn't, and they haven't seen justice. It's because they're being paid off.
Right.
That's not the same thing as justice.
They become part of the Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, I mean, a man was murdered. All kinds of circumstances leading up to it. You watch those videos, and it's just really sickening what occurred. And I have a lot of friends who are cops, and I know those guys are not that way. But there's something to be said when this occurs over and over again, and people aren't held accountable and justice is not served. We're no longer living in a democracy. We're no longer living in a nation where rule of law is paramount. We're living in a nation where certain classes are protected and certain others are violated.
We're living in a coup.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was a coup because, the status quo is what needs to be changed. So hopefully we can find a way to shake it up and change that. And I'd love for more people and more folks to be thinking about this and how through nonviolent civil disobedience, can we help change the system? I think Occupy was a good start, and I think a lot of lessons were learned from that, but it certainly needs to continue.
And we didn't really get, too much to talk about when you were on the panel at the Left Forum with Phil Donahue, the mother of Thomas Young, and Ray McGovern was also on the panel entitled Betrayed by Our Government. And, the moral injury, the post-traumatic stress. I feel like it's so important to talk about post-traumatic stress because to me, that is the body's version of being put into a debt that it's designed to never get out of.
Yeah, absolutely it is. It's the mind and the body are trying to deal with something that just cannot accept. And if people want to, the video is on my website. My website's MatthewHo.com, last name spelled HOH. I think it's on the second page of my website now, but you'll see Phil Donahue, you can click on it. Right. But yeah, I was very proud and honored to be on that panel with those folks. Kevin Lucy was also on the panel as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Matthew Ho, and his website, MatthewHo.com.
Thanks, Ken. I appreciate it. You have a good night.
You too. Good night. Thank you, listeners. Please tune in next Tuesday. Please donate even $1 on my YouTube channel, April Waters, to bring news, to bring great guests on this radio show like Matthew Ho. Have a great night.